Excessive self-regard tendency. We all commonly observe the excessive self-regard of man. He mostly misappraises himself on the high side, like the 90% of Swedish drivers that judge themselves to be above average. Such misappraisals also apply to a person's major possessions. One spouse usually overappraises the other spouse, and a man's children are likewise appraised higher by him than they are likely to be in a more objective view. Even man's minor possessions tend to be overappraised. Once owned, they suddenly become worth more to him than he would pay if they were offered for sale to him, and he didn't already own them. There is a name in psychology for this overappraise your own possessions phenomenon, the endowment effect. And all man's decisions are suddenly regarded by him as better than would have been the case just before he made them. Man's excess of self-regard typically makes him strongly prefer people like himself. Psychology professors have had much fun demonstrating this effect in lost wallet experiments. Their experiments all show that the finder of a lost wallet containing identity clues will be most likely to return the wallet when the owner most closely resembles the finder. Given this quality in psychological nature, cliquish groups of similar persons will always be a very influential part of human culture, even after we wisely try to dampen the worst effects. Some of the worst consequences in modern life come when dysfunctional groups of cliquish persons, dominated by excessive self-regard tendency, select as new members of their organizations persons who are very much like themselves. Thus, if the English department at an elite university becomes mentally dysfunctional, or the sales department of a brokerage firm slips into routine fraud, the problem will have a natural tendency to get worse and to be quite resistant to change for the better. So also with a police department or prison guard unit or political group gone sour, and countless other places mired in evil and folly, such as the worst of our big city teachers' unions that harm our children by preventing discharge of ineffective teachers. Therefore, some of the most useful members of our civilization are those who are willing to clean house when they find a mess under their ambit of control. Well, naturally, all forms of excess of self-regard cause much error. How could it be otherwise? Let us consider some foolish gambling decisions. In lotteries, the play is much lower when numbers are distributed randomly than it is when the player picks his own number. This is quite irrational. The odds are almost exactly the same and much against the player. Because state lotteries take advantage of man's irrational love of self-picked numbers, modern man buys more lottery tickets than he otherwise would have, with each purchase foolish. Intensify man's love of his own conclusions by adding the possessory wallop from the endowment effect, and you will find that a man who has already bought a pork belly future on a commodity exchange now foolishly believes, even more strongly than before, in the merits of his speculative bet. And foolish sports betting, by people who love sports and think they know a lot about relative merits of teams, is a lot more addictive than racetrack betting. Partly because of man's automatic overappraisal of his own complicated conclusions. Also extremely counterproductive is man's tendency to bet time after time in games of skill like golf or poker against people who are obviously much better players. Excessive self-regard tendency diminishes the foolish bettor's accuracy in appraising his relative degree of talent. More counterproductive yet are man's appraisals, typically excessive, of the quality of the future service he is to provide to his business. His overappraisal of these prospective contributions will frequently cause disaster. Excesses of self-regard often cause bad hiring decisions because employers grossly overappraise the worth of their own conclusions that rely on impressions in face-to-face contact. The correct antidote to this sort of folly is to underweigh face-to-face impressions and overweigh the applicant's past record. I once chose exactly this course of action while I served as chairman of an academic search committee. I convinced fellow committee members to stop all further interviews and simply appoint a person whose achievement record was much better than that of any other applicant. And when it was suggested to me that I wasn't giving academic due process, I replied that I was the one being true to academic values because I was using academic research showing poor predictive value of impressions from face-to-face interviews. Because man is likely to be over-influenced by face-to-face impressions that by definition involve his active participation, a job candidate who is a marvelous presenter often causes great danger under modern executive search practice. In my opinion, Hewlett-Packard faced just such a danger when it interviewed the articulate, dynamic Carly Fiorina in its search for a new CEO. And I believe, 1, that Hewlett-Packard made a bad decision when it chose Ms. Fiorina, and 2, that this bad decision would not have been made if Hewlett-Packard had taken the methodological precautions it would have taken if it knew more psychology. There is a famous passage somewhere in Tolstoy that illuminates the power of excessive self-regard tendency. According to Tolstoy, the worst criminals don't appraise themselves as all that bad. They come to believe either 1, that they didn't commit their crimes, or 2, that considering the pressures and disadvantages of their lives, it is understandable and forgivable that they behaved as they did and became what they became. The second half of the Tolstoy effect, where the man makes excuses for his fixable poor performance instead of providing the fix, is enormously important. Because a majority of mankind will try to get along by making way too many unreasonable excuses for fixable poor performance, it is very important to have personal and institutional antidotes limiting the ravages of such folly. On the personal level, a man should try to face the 2 simple facts. 1. Fixable but unfixed bad performance is bad character and tends to create more of itself, causing more damage to the excuse giver with each tolerated instance. And 2. In demanding places, like athletic teams and General Electric, you are almost sure to be discarded in due course if you keep giving excuses instead of behaving as you should. The main institutional antidotes to this part of the Tolstoy effect are 1. A fair, meritocratic, demanding culture, plus personnel handling methods that build up morale, and 2. Severance of the worst offenders. Of course, when you can't sever, as in the case of your own child, you must try to fix the child as best you can. I once heard of a child teaching method so effective that the child remembered the learning experience over 50 years later. The child later became dean of the USC School of Music, and then related to me what his father said when he saw his child taking candy from the stock of his employer with the excuse that he intended to replace it later. The father said, "Son, it would be better for you to simply take all you want and call yourself a thief every time you do it." The best antidote to folly from an excess of self-regard is to force yourself to be more objective when you are thinking about yourself, your family and friends, your property, and the value of your past and future activity. This isn't easy to do well and won't work perfectly, but it will work much better than simply letting psychological nature take its normal course. While an excess of self-regard is often counterproductive in its effects on cognition, it can cause some weird successes from overconfidence that happens to cause success. This factor accounts for the adage, "Never underestimate the man who overestimates himself." Of course, some high self-appraisals are correct and serve better than false modesty. Moreover, self-regard in the form of a justified pride in a job well done or a life well lived is a large constructive force. Without such justified pride, many more airplanes would crash. Pride is another word generally left out of psychology textbooks, and this omission is not a good idea. It is also not a good idea to construe the Bible's parable about the Pharisee and the publican as condemning all pride. Of all forms of useful pride, perhaps the most desirable is a justified pride in being trustworthy. Moreover, the trustworthy man, even after allowing for the inconveniences of his chosen course, ordinarily has a life that averages out better than he would have if he provided less reliability.